All right, so I guess we're going to start then. Hi everyone, welcome to today's lunch lecture. My name is Sanne Helbers from Studium Generale, TU Delft, and today we have programmed a lecture for you in the series of Spotting Bullshit. And this is the 5th lecture in this series, and the series is about ways of mental trickery and manipulation through media and even language. So we have zoomed in on logical fallacies, on troll armies, on fake news and fact checking. And today we're going to zoom in on social media manipulation. And of course, I guess we all use social media, and some a lot more than others maybe, but it has a very big impact on our lives. And the companies behind it, they have their own ways of persuading us in using their tools. And therefore, they can also have quite a big impact on our opinion and even on our democracy. So today we've invited Michael Klenk. And Michael is a lecturer in ethics and philosophy of technology at the TPM faculty. And he has researched topics in the ethics of technology related to social media and business ethics as well. So before we start, I'd like to tell you that this Zoom session is being recorded. You can add your questions in the chat, and this will not be visible in the recording. And otherwise, you can unmute yourselves and ask your question out loud if you like to. But this, of course, will be visible in the recording. So that is up to you. So, Michael, may I please invite you then to enlighten us on the social media manipulation?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sanne, and thanks for inviting me to this lecture. And hello to everyone who zoomed in. So this is me. The background is the Delft library, and there's some see-through effects. So we are up for a good start, and let's go straight ahead to the question of social media manipulation. I want to begin with a little question and a little story, perhaps. So let's go back to 2004. Mark Zuckerberg was in Harvard, college student, and he basically programmed and set up the first, the predecessor of Facebook. It's a social network to connect people, young people, and college students to share interests, exchange pictures, stay in touch with each other. So that seems to be quite a benign and lovely goal, a nice activity. And it's just fascinating how just 14 years later, we have the CEO of that company testify and appear in front of the European Parliament and apologize for what the company has become, especially with their involvement in the Cambridge Analytica data scandal that you probably all heard about. We have questions and concerns about people being addicted to social media. Not only Facebook, that's just a very vivid example, but on a broad spectrum of these platforms. They have become so dominant in our lives that people fear that they cannot be attentive and focused on a task at hand anymore. They're always chasing that next like, that next notification. And how can that be from these humble and innocent beginnings, you might ask? We have the Cambridge Analytica scandal, as I just said. We have a whole new phenomenon that emerged seemingly in the last couple of years, fake news, which probably have quite drastic real-world implications outside of these online virtual networks, where people become more and more isolated with their epistemic and worldviews, because these kind of online platforms and social media tend to promote things that you already believe in. That's the stuff that you get to see. So how can that be? How can we come from these humble beginnings at a little college in the United States to this worldwide phenomenon with all these worrisome consequences? And of course, one of the suspicions that many people have is that manipulation perhaps is the phenomenon behind that. So perhaps social media is inviting manipulation of people by other people or government or other institutions. Perhaps social media in itself, the technology in itself, is manipulative. But of course, that's just a suspicion and a big question. And Today, what I want to do with you is basically follow that question and see where it leads us and see whether we can find an answer. Is there something like social media manipulation? We'll basically do four things. We'll look at the phenomenon in a bit more detail. Then we look to the past. Then we look to the concept of manipulation. And then we'll have a bit purview into the future. But I also want to involve you and ask you a question. And for that, we are going to use menti.com. And I'm asking you about how satisfied you are with your internet use. So if you go to menti.com right now and use the code 6681726, then you have a more specified question. And then I ask you to rate how satisfied you are with certain platforms and how much time you spend on these platforms. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, then I guess post them to the chat or let me know, then we can address them right away. Okay. So let's see what your answers are. I'll give you perhaps one more minute. Okay, so that's there's some movement here already. So satisfaction with use against time spent on that platform. Okay. So I think we take that as one second. I'll just check how many people answered already. Okay, I think that's good for now. So what we see is basically what I asked you to plot, and what you all plotted is basically, so there's still some movement here, so feel free to fill that out as we go. What we see here is basically a comparison of the time you spend on a certain platform. We have several social media platforms, but also related platforms like YouTube and Gmail, which is not social media, against the satisfaction with use. And my prediction would have been that the more time you spend on a platform, the less satisfied you are with the use. So that there is a kind of indicator of people's perhaps kind of almost addiction, you might say, to these kinds of platforms. So what we see is that especially Facebook and Instagram, which are, I think, the most paradigmatic social media platforms, are quite low in their satisfaction, and WhatsApp, which is also a kind of social media, scores quite high. Now, the interesting difference between these two groups, Facebook and Instagram versus WhatsApp, YouTube, and Gmail, is that Facebook and Instagram is in a very specific sense tailored to maximizing your time on using that platform. It is a social media, but it is very much focused on getting you to spend as much time on that platform as possible, which is not as possible when you're using WhatsApp, for example, because there you have user-to-user interaction instead of one user that focuses on interactions with many others. So let's see what especially is happening on these two things that scored quite low, Facebook and Instagram. Switching screens briefly. Okay, so what research has found so far when we look at the phenomenon of social media manipulation is that social media influences, is capable of influencing our beliefs and our behavior as well. So when you use these platforms, then there is a real chance and a real possibility that there can be an intentional change in what you believe and how you behave. And here's just one example of a very interesting study. So there's research that shows that Facebook likes correlate with personality traits. For example, people that like things like Stargate or computers, they're predominantly, and on average, they are more, that's the opposite, they're introverted, not extroverted. So Stargate and computers, for example, when this is liked on Facebook, that indicates introversion. Now, of course, what people can do who have that kind of information is they can target ads to people specified depending on what their personality profile shows. And this particular research that I'm citing here has found that there's up to 50% more purchases. So there's a real, very real effect on using that information that you can gain from social media to affect real world behavioral change. Now, for example, here on the left, you see an ad that targeted extroverted people. There was a beauty product for women. So dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. That you can see perhaps appeals to extroverted people. And the very same product with a very different ad, beauty doesn't have to shout, targeted at introverted people. And that works. And how does it work? Based on the information that people gain through social media and use social media to influence people in turn. It's not only beliefs and cognition that are basically influenced on social media, it's also emotions. And one very interesting study that has been making the rounds recently is that emotions are contagious. That means that you tend to assimilate your emotions to the emotions of people that you interact with. And that particular study basically identified words that signify positive and negative emotions in Facebook posts. And then that study for about 600,000 Facebook users manipulated their news feed. So it systematically, for example, reduced the number of positive words that appeared in people's news feeds. And what they found is that those people that had these kind of news feeds with reduced positive words, in turn posted more negative words. And the implication is, of course, that they had more negative emotions. So the very fact that you're using social media can have an impact on your emotions, and these emotions can be targeted and directed by whoever controls or administers that newsfeed. So that's quite interesting. There's this influence exerted by social media on us is real. Okay, but what's the problem here? The problem, as I already indicated, is that there might be this kind of influence that we are discussing might be a problematic kind of influence. Perhaps somebody is pulling our strings in the background. And that person might, of course, whoever is administering and the boss of that social media network, again, picking out Mark Zuckerberg or Facebook, but it applies to all these kinds of social media platforms that have this business model. But it might also be, and that will be my focus, the social media technology itself and how that technology acts in a certain way autonomously and independent of whoever uses social media to influence others. Now, the question, of course, then would be, okay, we have that suspicion, social media might be manipulative. So we just need to look at what manipulation is and see whether social media and influence by technology fits the bill, so to speak. Okay, and we can look to the past because manipulation has forever played a big role in our lives as human beings. So when you look to our hunter-gatherer ancestors and the Stone Age ancestors, we are a cooperative species and forever dependent on social coordination and social cooperation to survive. So this this act of influencing others and getting them to do what you want and perhaps what's in your interest or the interest of your group is something that is ingrained in us. It's paramount importance for us as a social species. So what can you do? You can persuade others. You can give them good reasons to team up with you and, for example, go on a hunt together. You can, if you're much stronger than them, of course, you don't need to talk. You don't need to give them reasons and convince them or give them an argument. You can just force them. You can coerce them. But what happens if you cannot convince them by arguments, if you cannot convince them by force? And I think that's where manipulation comes in. Manipulation is a way of influencing others when you do not want to go the way of convincing them, letting them make the choice. And you're also not strong enough to just avoid all these reasons and discussion and just force them to do it. Okay, so manipulation probably played a role in our lives forever since we exist as a species. And you can see that back in basically art and literature. So you look, for example, to the stories of Native Americans. You have tricksters there, like Old Man Coyote, which is a tricky, manipulative figure who figures out how people work and influence them behind the back. And you have these kinds of figures in basically every body of myths and legends and literature. Look to the ancient Greeks and their myth of Odysseus, who was also a trickster, who came up with the Trojan horse to overpower an opponent when persuasion or pure might wouldn't work anymore. So you would think that this stuff that plays such a big role in our history as human species and that we find back in arts and literature would also be reflected in the law and in philosophy. So we have a good idea of what manipulation is and whether you're allowed to do it or not. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Up until now, because manipulation is very hard to grasp, and you probably have to look and ask what people actually believe and what they want when they manipulate, the law has basically avoided any kind of discussion of manipulation so far. So that's a problem, because when we want to say social media is manipulative, we first need an idea of what manipulation is. And that's what we'll do right now. We'll do some philosophy together and basically try to figure out what the heck this concept of manipulation is, so that we then can go back to social media and see, hey, is that stuff manipulative? So what we're going to do is basically a very light form and a straightforward thing. Okay, an example of conceptual analysis and what's called the method of cases. We want to know what is this concept, manipulation. And one way to do that is to look at things that look like paradigmatic, like typical cases of manipulation. And then we see what kind of features we can extract from these cases. What's essential? What are the core features of something that is manipulative? And that is the philosophical method of conceptual analysis. And here's a case that very much seems like a paradigm case of manipulation. And it's Shakespeare's Othello. And, I made a very, very unliterary version of that. And perhaps I give away the spoiler. But here's basically the gist of the story. Othello is married to Desdemona. But there's Iago, and he's jealous of them. And in the course of the story, he basically makes Othello believe that Desdemona is cheating on him. For example, and it's one of the key moments, he puts a handkerchief, the first gift that Othello ever gave to Desdemona, in another man's, in Cassio's possession. So when Othello sees that, it very much looks like Desdemona is having an affair with that man, but of course she doesn't. But Othello is furious about this. He believes that Desdemona is cheating on him, and he eventually kills Desdemona, just like Iago intended. The question is, of course, did Iago manipulate Othello? I want to ask you that again. Again, you go back to your Menti screen. You can go back to menti.com and use the code 6681726. And basically, there's a number of questions. And right now, I just want you to focus on the first question. So there's a number of options, and just look at the Othello option. If you think that Othello was manipulated by Iago, then say yes, select that option. If you don't think so, then do nothing for now, and we come back to that later. So let's see. I think I need to So I think that the question should show up right now. Cool. So if you just focus on the first option, Othello, if you think he was manipulated, then select it. If not, do nothing for now. And again, if you need a code, that's menti.com and then 6681726. Okay. Okay, so I think most people have voted by now. So to my mind, and of course we might disagree and could have a discussion later, to my mind, that's a paradigm case. This is a typical case of manipulation. If we want to know what manipulation is, basically I point you to this case and say, you know, this is what manipulation is. Iago did manipulate Othello. Now what's going on? There's a number of things, and I think 3 important features, and that many other people have pointed out. For one, Iago bypasses reasons. So he doesn't present a very good argument to Othello for why Desdemona is cheating on him. He basically appeals to his emotions and to his affectionate love for Desdemona, of course, then for he appeals to his jealousy when he discovers this handkerchief in that other man's possession. And by doing so, and that's what many people think is typical of manipulation, he avoids talking about, he avoids persuasion and instead goes the path of emotions and reasons to influence and get someone else to do what he wants. He clearly deceives the victim because Othello ends up believing that Desdemona is cheating on him, which she's not. And so he's, in a sense, creating a false belief in Othello. And there's a third thing, he undermines in a very real and important sense the autonomy of Othello, because autonomy means that you lead your life according to your own aims of your own choosing. And of course, Othello would have had different plans with his life, and Iago certainly frustrates that autonomy. So you might think, just by looking at this case, and of course we can look at many others as well, and you might think that these 3 factors are the crucial, the essential pieces of manipulation. Once we discover them, we know what manipulation is.
Mikael, can I interrupt you?
Sure.
I just received a question from Rob, and he asked, wouldn't you say that he offers a very good reason, but the reason is based on false assumptions?
Yeah, Rob, that's a good point. It's just that, what he does is he deceives him in a sense of creating a false belief. So you're right, basically based on putting that information out there. If you only have that information available, then there's a certain conclusion you can draw. For example, Desdemona is cheating. But of course, this information, these are red herrings, they're false information. And so he ends up believing a falsity. And in that sense, it's deception. So a good belief would, first of all, be true, and it would be based on good evidence. And what Iago is doing is basically create a false belief based on evidence that only from a certain perspective is convincing. But if you look at it overall or objectively, it's not evidence. Okay. Cool. So let's put Othello to the side for now and look at 3 more cases here. Because basically the next step would be to check our idea that these 3 things, autonomy, reason, and deception, are essential to manipulation. So first case, politician. A politician learns that voters are very much concerned about the environment. So she has a clever plan. She gives good arguments for protecting the earth in her election campaign, and she's consequently voted into office. But in fact, the politician herself does not believe at all and doesn't care about the environment at all. Did the politician manipulate the voters? second case. And basically what we can do is you can go back to Menti, and then you can vote on these things, and then I read out the cases to you again. Okay, so now there's these other three options that were available, and you can vote on them as I read out these cases. Because you can see my presentation, right? Right now. Yeah.
Can you please call the numbers again for the Menti?
Yeah. So the Menti is 6681 726. And then you should be on that question with Othello again. Right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Cool. Okay, so three cases. Politician. A politician learns that voters are concerned about the environment. Long story short, she gives good arguments, convinces the voters to vote her into office, but she doesn't care about the environment at all. The second case, it's about a husband, Mark. So he's a horrible cook, and Carola, his wife, by now knows that after being married to him for years. And Mark doesn't really take rejection lightly. So whenever he's rejected, he's very hurt. And at lunch, he tells her, you know, eat the food I cooked for you, or I will hurt myself. Did Mark manipulate his wife, Carola? And then the final thing is the paternalist. So here we have a school cafeteria manager, and he's the decision, okay, how do I arrange the food? And he knows that placing certain stuff to the front in certain places will boost or limit the consumption of that food. So consequently, he puts the healthy food right in front, and all the unhealthy food, the fatty stuff, he puts right at the back, so it gets consumed less. So vote for all of these cases if you think it's a case of manipulation. Okay, and I go back briefly to the results, see what we have, and share that with you. Okay, so now you should see the results coming in. Good, interesting, and I think that's where we are right now. So what's interesting is that we had the paradigm case of Othello, where, let's say, most people said, okay, this is a case of manipulation. We identified three features that we thought might be perhaps indicative or essential to manipulation. And then we look at three other cases, and I basically designed them so that they lack all of these features. Now, there's no reason bypassing. The politician gives good arguments for a true conclusion, and people believe that based on good arguments, they have a true belief. Still, that seems like manipulation. Now, at least 4 people said that. So if that's the case, then we have to rethink whether bypassing of reasons is really essential to manipulation. And same with the deception case. Now with the husband case, so here we have a guy who perhaps uses emotional pressure to get what he wants, but we have no case of deception, we have no case of autonomy undermining, and we have no case of bypassing reasons. So again, we have to, that's a counterexample to our earlier theory. And finally, the paternalist case is interesting because here we have a good outcome, something that is good for the people that are influenced in a certain way. And yet it seems like it's a case of manipulation. So what on earth is manipulation after this? Let's go back, and I have a tentative answer for you. So what we learned basically from this little rough exercise, and of course, I guess there's questions later on about this, but what we can conclude, I think, is that we have reasons to doubt or to think that there is manipulation without bypassing reasons, that does not undermine autonomy, and that there is manipulation without deception. But I think there's still a common factor, and that's basically the gist and at the heart of the presentation today. What is manipulation? And I think that there is a common factor. So we influence each other in countless ways. For example, I aim to make you do A, and the result is you do A. And I think we have to understand manipulation. It's something that is just that is lacking something important. This, I think, is manipulation. if we have the aim to make somebody do that, and that's it, that's our only aim. Why? Because we do not care to help the other person to see why A is reasonable for them. So there's something, manipulation, we have to understand it as something that is lacking something important instead of understanding it as something that has some problematic feature. Because when I aim to help you see why your action is reasonable, why you should do that, then there's a chance that you do A, okay, but you do it on good reasons. And basically the aim of the interaction should be to help you to come to see your reasons and to do whatever I intend you to do based on these good reasons. And not doing that, basically going just from wanting you to do A and not caring about anything else, is a lack of care for these reasons. And here again, we come back to the, and then I'm almost finished. And we come back to these questions about bullshit, because I very much think that manipulation is like bullshit. Because some philosophers have studied what bullshit is, and we look to the top column, at the top row, I mean. And basically you can distinguish three things. You can want to speak truly, so you care for truth, top left, or you care for falsehood, you want to deceive someone. But when you do not care about truth at all, you just want to say something to have a certain effect on other people, to appear popular or whatnot, then you're bullshitting. So in the middle column, it's a bullshit alert. And I think manipulation works very much similarly. You can care for reasons and want others to persuade them. You can care for irrationality, you want to deceive them, or you just don't care about reasons at all. And I think that's where we are with manipulation. Okay, and very much final words looking to the future. Because we can ask, who's the problem here? We can ask, do we have to look at Facebook and Google and Twitter and whatnot, the people working there, the CEOs of these companies, or the people using these platforms to influence others? So we look at how people influence other people using these platforms. That's one perspective. I think it's an important one, but I also think it's a mistaken one, or it falls short, because we're looking here at technology just like we would look at a hammer that is basically not doing anything independently of the user. And at Delft and at other universities in the ethics of technology, it's very much clear that technology is not this neutral thing that just depends on how it is used, on what effects it affords or what behavior it invites. So I would rather suggest that we look at technology as something, especially as it becomes more autonomous, as the focus point of our study, and questioning in what sense does the technology itself manipulate. And you look to the things of to what degree we are already influenced by technology. On the bottom layer, when you kind of want to look at how autonomous and how impactful these technologies are, you have recommender systems that suggest the next video that you watch on YouTube or Netflix, the next newsfeed item you see on Facebook. We interact with that stuff daily, myriad of times. We have person-to-person AI-mediated communication. So whenever you see these automated replies, you send me a message and I have this Gmail, for example, already suggests, yes, thank you, or great idea. That's a mediated communication. And here we have technology in the loop that is doing some of the influencing for us. We go further with virtual assistants like Alexa or Siri. We already have care robots that exist in the physical world. And someday there might be more general AIs. So these technologies, I think, have on their own the capacity to manipulate. And if that's our question, if that's our focus, if we want to focus on these potential influences of us, the question is, of course, can, do, and should machines care about our reasons? So when you wonder about online manipulation or social media manipulation, and you wonder whether these platforms themselves can manipulate you, then with this idea that manipulation is a lack of care, the question just becomes, how on earth could technology care about my reasons for acting? Is there any way how they could point out what I should do or why I should do it? Of course, we don't want this kind of simple nudges that is sometimes manipulative. But what we want is basically to ask these broader questions. How can machines care for our reasons? Do we ourselves care for our reasons all the time? Because sometimes you might say manipulation might lead to good things. For example, the cafeteria example. Perhaps we can be manipulated, but it's a good thing overall in some cases. And then, of course, the more we interact with technology, the question is, how can technology know what's good for us? How can they know what I think is good for me? And how can technology help promote that aim? Instead of promoting an aim, for example, on social media, that I just stay on it and use it all the time. Okay, thanks. Now I'm interested in your questions.
Thank you very much, Mikael. There was some other question or remark from some people about the 3 cases, the husband case, because they do consider that as manipulation, since it is coercion, and which could also be defined as a form of manipulation. Mm-hmm. Do you agree on that?
Yeah, actually I do. I think that, coercion has some similarities with manipulation. In a sense that people do not care, so reasons do not play a role in coercion. Okay, and I think that we have to make a distinction between the two based on the ability of the person doing the influencing to overpower the other using force. And I think that's a distinguishing factor between coercion and manipulation. But whoever asked that is very right. Point out that reasons just they don't figure in the equation at all.
Okay, thanks. Like you pointed out, you said that the social media platforms are like a hammer, and within their platforms, it is always the case that there is manipulation. But don't you think that the companies behind these platforms have a role in this? And maybe they should care for our reasons, or at least take them into account.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So by saying that we should focus on the technology, I'm not saying we should, ignore the other things. It's clear that there's a certain business model behind social media that depends on maximizing how much time users spend on that platform, and that encourages to use a certain kind of technology. And so the recommender systems are basically they try to maximize and predict what content will make you stay on that site for longer. And to a certain extent, you can, of course, change that, by passing new laws, passing certain restrictions of how these sites function. But what I just want to say is that the technology itself can be an interesting object of analysis, because it is questionable that even if they have good aims, the technology companies, so say we solve that problem, and they want to use autonomous machines, and autonomous machines in the sense that they kind of look what behavior we show and adapt their behavior based on our actions, like a YouTube recommender system. In what sense can we program these recommender systems so that they care for our reasons? So that's a big question, just independently of whether the aims of the company are good. And if we cannot answer that question positively, if they don't care for our reasons or cannot, then the question is, is there any way of non-manipulative influence by technology?
Okay. I have another question from Anna. She asked, shouldn't one of the criteria for manipulation be that the manipulator does it consciously?
Good question. Yeah, that's what many people think. And I think all of the cases, yeah, so basically question back is, what do you think about the husband case? Because here's a case I think that many people think is manipulative. And you actually have in psychology that where people study emotional pressure. And I think that many people do that unconsciously. So people that are like Mark, that use kind of emotional pressure, they say, okay, if you don't do that, I feel very bad. And that pressures other people to do whatever they want. I don't think that these people make a plan like Iago, who says, I want to do this, and this is how I will do it. I will use these and these methods. So I think that these kinds of cases we would describe as manipulative, and that speaks against this intentionality.
And Anna is also one of the people who thought that the husband case is manipulation, actually. So.
Okay. Yeah.
Can I add to this?
Yeah, sure.
So, well, yeah, but then you mean that the husband manipulates subconsciously, but there is still, I mean, if he thinks about it, he can realize, it is possible for him to realize what he's doing. So there is still some kind of a concept of consciousness,
I see
which
what you mean.
doesn't really apply to technology. You cannot say that YouTube manipulates me to watch the next video. Maybe someone who wrote the algorithm to suggest me those videos is manipulating me, but the YouTube itself, it's kind of a vague thing.
Yeah, I see the point. So what you're suggesting, Anna, is that basically in order to have a case of manipulative behavior, there has to be the capacity to care for reasons, and the very capacity to understand what it means for somebody to have reasons and to point them out. If you don't have that, and probably technology doesn't have that capacity, certainly not yet, then it's a mistake to apply the term manipulation to these kinds of things. And I think to a certain degree that's right. Perhaps we cannot speak of manipulative technology. I would, however, say that we can speak of being manipulated by technology. That would certainly be a bit of a shift from earlier discussions, the few discussions that already exist of manipulation, that always treated these things as very much related. So an analysis of what manipulative behavior is, and an analysis of what being manipulated is. And I think we should put them apart, because I think it is important that we have a reasonable way of talking about being manipulated by technology, rather than just the people behind it.
Okay, let's see, we have some more questions here. Do you think that manipulation is a step that intends to lead to coercion if pressure means becomes available?
Come again, I didn't understand the first part, please.
Don't you think manipulation is a step that intends to lead to coercion if pressure means become available?
Yeah, I see it. So I wouldn't say it's something, again, so I think that's certainly possible. I wouldn't right now know where to draw the line between these kinds of emotional pressure cases and coercion. I think it's an interesting question where to draw the line. I certainly don't think that people who manipulate always have the aim to coerce at some later points, or something like, okay, if I could, I would rather coerce, but I can't, so I manipulate. I don't think that's the case, because I don't think that manipulation needs to be intentional. And yet again, I think it's an interesting question how we distinguish between manipulative pressuring cases and cases that are coercion already. Because for coercion, of course, we have, and that's the interesting thing, for coercion, we have laws already. So contracts that you make under duress, if you're very stressed or forced to do something, then that doesn't, and you sign a contract, that doesn't count. So we have a legal and a philosophical understanding of what it means to be coerced and what it means to coerce. And the general thought so far has been, yeah, manipulation is something, related, but not quite. It's something between persuasion and coercion. And the challenge is, of course, to say, where does it lie exactly?
Yeah, it's more voluntarily than that there is put pressure on us. But
yeah.
How autonomous can you say that we still are on social media platforms? Do we still have autonomy?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. And in what way?
Yeah. I think that, okay, how do I say that? I think you can have two perspectives on autonomy, very roughly speaking. One is that you do what you want to do. Okay, so you say, today I want to work, and that's my main goal, and then I am able to do all the steps to reach that goal. Okay, so that's one sense of autonomy. And I think if you look at that sense of autonomy, there's no study that suggests that people kind of fall short of these ideals. I think there's definitely, I myself have that, there's anecdotal evidence that you say, okay, I want to write this book or whatever, and then you have to check social media all the time and you get distracted. But there's no evidence for the sense that we are not able to live up to our own aspirations as an effect of social media. So, if you have that kind of higher order, lower order idea of autonomy, it doesn't seem to be affected. And then there's a very different perspective of autonomy that says you're autonomous to the extent that your motivations are your own motivations in some sense. They're not the motivations that are implanted by somebody else into you, or that come from the environment. And with that perspective, it's just very difficult to say, where do you stop and where does the environment begin, so that you can say, okay, this is not an influence that comes from myself. And I don't think that social media plays a particularly interesting role in kind of making that distinction.
Okay. So we have the question from class, and he says, I like your question about whether or not technology can be unmanipulative at all. If not, could we at the very least ask social media platforms to add disclaimers that they are manipulating users and how they are manipulating us?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's a kind of how do you react to the situation? I think that would be a first step in the right direction. You can also, but well, it's also a question how much that would change, because I think by now you have many people that are aware of what's going on in social media, that use it nonetheless. I don't think that changes anything about the fact of whether or not they are manipulated or they're not manipulated, and whether or not social media is manipulative. And second thing, I think there is some function like that already on Facebook. I don't use Facebook, but I've seen it with others, that I think you already see something like, we show you this content because you liked, I don't know, you liked that video, and that's why we show you this video right now. So in that sense, they don't talk about, hey, we are manipulating you in this way, but they at least say, we do this because that. Okay, and so that gives you perhaps some more, in that sense, gives you a bit more insight into the reasons you might have. Because if YouTube shows you, we show you that video because you watched that video, you might think, hey, I didn't really like that other video, so perhaps I don't have reasons to continue watching. And perhaps right now people trust these systems too much and think, okay, it just must be good because it's recommended to me.
So perhaps we should, be taught in some sort of awareness campaign that these platforms are actually manipulative, or can be, that we at least should be aware of that.
Yeah, I think so. So the question is, also if you're asking about practical recommendations, I think the question is, how much do you care about doing something that's reasonable, that's good for you, that you have good reasons to do, and to what degree do you think that social media or these internet platforms help you to actually assess that? Do they tell you, okay, these are the pros and cons and the reasons for you to follow up and follow through? Or are they really measured and geared towards making you behave in a certain way without regard for these reasons at all?
Okay. So if there are no further questions, there we go. We have one last question that we're going to... Class again asks, are kids today who grew up with social media more or less aware than adults of being manipulated?
I don't know. Short answer. I'm not sure. would be interesting though, whether you see, perhaps adaptation or adaptive effects, so people learn how these systems work and change their behavior in response. But basically, it's an empirical question that you have to assess, and I'm not aware that anyone has done that so far.
Okay.
That's an interesting question, definitely.
Okay, the very, very last. Roy asks, should we also force advertisers to divulge how they are manipulating us?
Yeah, so it's an interesting point because it draws the connection between advertising and social media. Because advertising, of course, in a certain way, they want to go the manipulative route as well. And has been a known issue for long. And there's 2 points that are interesting about this. First, it shows that it's worthwhile to focus on technology as a new thing. Why? Because though in principle, the advertising company and Facebook are the same. They have certain business aims and want to influence the user in a certain way, or the client. But what's changed is that basically they have automated means of influence. So their means of influencing us have certain automatic routines. And I think that's what distinguishes them, and that's what we should focus on. Are these means in themselves perhaps capable of manipulation? And then the second point is, I don't think it would change much if we just point out manipulation in a sense of just flagging, manipulation is going on. Why? Because if the manipulation is really good, I don't think it changes. For example, the husband case again, I think people might very well know that there's some manipulation going on. And, you can imagine the case, the wife saying, "You're manipulating me again," but what can she do? It just works. So I don't think that this kind of just pointing it out there would change much.
Okay, thank you. So that's it for today. Thank you very much, Mikael, for your lecture and the questions afterwards. And thank you all, everybody here for attending this lecture online. December 15, we have our very last lecture within the Spotting Bullshit series, and this is about deep fakes. And fortunately, it looks like that we can still welcome people to the TU Delft library for this. So there, of course, is a limited amount of people, but we are able to do that actually offline as well. And otherwise, you can, of course, tune in on the live stream for that. So thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank you all too. Have a good day. Bye-bye.